Okay, so what if the existence of God wasn't a matter of faith, but a matter of pure, hard logic? That's the claim we're digging into today. It comes from Chris Langan, a man with one of the highest IQs ever recorded, who says he's developed a logical proof for God's existence. So, let's see how he builds this incredible case.
The mind we're talking about here has an IQ of around 200. I mean, just to give you some perspective, a score of 140 is already considered genius territory. So 200, yeah, that's on a whole other level.
A score that high is, well, it's just incredibly rare. You're literally talking about one person in several billion. And the reason we're starting here is to get one thing straight. This isn't just an argument from someone who's smart. We're looking at a mind that might just operate on a completely different plane.
And if you want to see how he stacks up against the greats, just look at this. Historians have estimated Einstein's IQ was around 160. Isaac Newton may be 190. Langan's tested score puts him right up there with them, maybe even beyond. This is the kind of intellectual firepower behind the proof we're about to walk through.
So just to be super clear about what we're doing here, we're setting aside all the usual stuff. No scripture, no belief, none of that. Instead, we're going to follow a chain of pure reasoning that treats God's existence not as something you have to believe in, but as a conclusion you arrive at through logic. All right, the whole argument kicks off with one single, really foundational idea about what reality even is.
Langan's starting point is actually super simple. He says that for reality to exist, it has to have an identity. It has to be something. This isn't some deep philosophical trick. It's just a basic requirement. Anything that exists has to have properties that define what it is. It's itself. And this is where Langan makes his first big leap. He points to that famous biblical story where Moses asks for God's name, and the answer that comes back is, "I am that I am." Langan argues this isn't just a name, it's a statement of pure existence. In his framework, God is identity itself, the very concept of being. Okay, so if we roll with that first premise, that reality has a fundamental identity, the next logical question is, well, what are its properties? What does this identity actually look like?
So Langan lays this out in a pretty clear three-step process. First, he builds that framework we just talked about. Reality is an identity. Then, he uses logic to figure out what qualities this all-encompassing identity has to have. And the final step? He just observes that these logically necessary properties, well, they happen to line up perfectly with the traditional attributes of God.
So what exactly comes out of his logical model? Well, it's the classic 3 O's: omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence, plus consciousness. For example, he'd argue that for an identity to contain all of reality, it must, by definition, contain all the knowledge of reality. And what is that? That's omniscience. See? According to Langan, these aren't things you take on faith. They are properties this identity must have for reality to even make sense. This brings us to the next piece of the puzzle. And it's a big one because it tackles a major challenge to this whole idea of a single, all-encompassing identity. Right, here's the big question. If reality is defined by this one, big, static identity, then how does anything change? How do we get from one moment to the next? How does a tiny seed become a giant tree if the underlying identity is fixed? To solve this, Langan uses a pretty cool modern analogy. He says to think of reality like a computer system. The display? That's everything we see and experience, all the objects, their states, right now in this moment. But for the image on that screen to change, you need a processor humming along in the background, right? Something that manages the shift from one state to the next and makes sure the whole system doesn't just crash. And that brings us right to the core of his argument. Langan basically identifies God with this necessary processing function. In his model, God is the underlying principle that allows things to change over time while keeping reality from just falling apart into chaos. He's the coherence engine of the entire universe. And this leads us to the final and, maybe the most profound part of this whole argument. The part that connects this huge cosmic idea directly to you and me. Because according to Langan's model, this divine processor isn't some cold, distant, impersonal force out there in the cosmos. Nope, it's actually intimately involved with our own existence. He even redefines the whole concept of being made in the image of God in almost mathematical terms. He calls it a mapping. In his view, God, this ultimate identity, maps himself directly into each and every one of us. So we're not just separate creations, we're direct reflections of the central organizing principle of reality itself. And here's how it all comes home to you, your own personal existence. Think about it.
Your ability to maintain a coherent sense of you from one second to the next, even while your body, your cells, your thoughts are constantly changing, that, Langan argues, requires the active function of this divine processor.
And you know, when you step back, what makes this 200 IQ argument so powerful for a lot of people is that it tries to bridge two worlds that often feel like they're miles apart. It lays out this vision where a personal, conscious God isn't just something you hope for, but a conclusion you can reach through rational necessity.
And so, we're left with the pretty powerful question, right? Whether you find the argument convincing or not, it really forces you to wonder, could something like pure logic actually be the ultimate bridge between the worlds of science and faith?